Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Had a little delay there. I'd like to dedicate today's learning in memory of my mother, Mr. Shlomo Rabinowitz, Shlomo Spas Rav Yaakov Eliezer. And this week's learning is sponsored by Mr. Richard Goldstein, member of his father, Joseph Goldstein, Zalman ben Yosef. We are about to begin a new tractate today, Mishna Harah, and we're on Parak Aleph, chapter 1, Mishna Aleph, Mishnah 1. Now, challah, which is a common word that we use for the bread we eat on Shabbos, but actually when the Torah refers to challah, it's referring to a law that when one kneads a dough, one has to make a separation from that dough and give that separation to the Kohen. Just as when we're discussing Truma, that when you have produce, you separate from the produce and give some of it to the Kohen. When you knead a dough, you are to separate some of that dough to give it to the Kohen. That is that's the mitzvah that these Mishnayos are discussing. So the first thing that the Mishnah teaches us is Chamisha Devar Machavim B'Challah. There are 5 things, 5 types of grains that are obligated in challah, which means if you take those grains, turn them into flour, and turn that flour into a dough, there'll be an obligation to separate challah from that dough. What are the 5 things that have the obligation of challah? Hachitim, wheat, vasaorim, barley, vakusmin, spelt, shual, oats, vashifon, rye. These are what we call the 5 grains, and these 5 grains are relevant to many halachas, many laws in the Torah. And right now, we are saying that the mitzvah of challah only comes from doughs made from these grains. If you were to make a rice dough or a millet dough, you would not have an obligation to separate challah from that. Harah chayavin b'challah. All these species have an obligation of challah. Umitztarfin zeh im zeh, and they can combine with each other. What that means is like this. We are going to learn that in a little bit later on in the Mishnayos, that there's a minimum amount of flour from which the dough is made for the obligation of challah to take effect. If you make a little piece of dough, there's no obligation of challah from that. The dough has to be made from a minimum amount of flour to say that dough will have the obligation of challah to be separated from it. And the amount that's given is 1 1/4 kav of flour. Kav is a certain dry measure, and it's 1 1/4 kav of flour. The dough made of that amount of flour has an obligation of challah. Now, when the Mishnah says that the species can combine with each other, that means like this. That means if you take a little bit of all these species, and you mix them, take a little bit of flour from all these species, mix them together, and make a dough out of it. And the amount of flour from the combination of all these, of whatever combination making these 5 species, was a kav and a quarter of flour. Then, although the flour was made of not the same species, it was made out of different ones, a combination of different ones. It'll still be obligated. It'll be obligated in a challah. If you go ahead, if you make that 1 1/4 kav of flour with a combination, including rice flour or millet flour, that's helping you get to your minimum of 1 1/4 kav. Then there are exceptions, but that will be a situation where we say that you can't make that combination because the rice flour, for instance, is not a species that has obligation of challah, and therefore it cannot combine together with other ones to make the obligation for challah. And therefore the Mishnah says it can combine. The Ratanura points out that this combination that we're talking about, that it seems to be that we're saying you can make any combination of the 5 species, only applies to when you're talking about making a flour out of that making a dough out of that combination. Meaning it's a combination of flour made from the different species together. It doesn't have to be all 5 together. It could be whatever combination you want. But if we're talking about a combination made by combining doughs, you made separate doughs. Each one each one did not come from a 1 1/4 kav of flour. But now you take those 2 doughs and you combine them together. And now you'll have a dough made out of 1 1/4 kav of flour. Once you made them into dough, and you want to combine those, then the combinations are limited. Then already the combinations can only work, for instance, when it comes to wheat, you can do wheat and spelt. You can't do wheat and barley, because essentially, even in the 5 grains that we're talking about here, there are different species within the species. And the baseline breaks down into 2 groups. You've got the wheat group and you've got the barley group, 2 different groups. So if it's still in a state of flour, they can all combine. Once they become doughs, you can only combine one type with the other. So one type with the other would mean, for instance, wheat and spelt, but not wheat and barley or wheat and oats. Okay. The Mishnah continues, again, continuing with another halacha, another law that applies specifically to the 5 grains. Va'asurin b'chadash melefnei ha'pesach u'miliktzar melefnei ha'omer. They are forbidden as the new crop from before Pesach and from harvesting before the Omer is harvested. So a couple of things. And in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, on the 2nd day of Pesach, there was a special meal offering, a special carbon mincha, a meal offering called the Omer, and it was made from the first ripened barley of the new harvest year. And that was brought. And that barley for that offering was harvested on the night of the 2nd day of Pesach, meaning the night is the beginning of the day. So on the night of the 2nd day of Pesach was harvested. And in the times of Beis HaMikdash, it was only 1 day of Yontif in the sense of treating it like Shabbos. So already by the second night, after the first day was over and the second night began, it was already Cholamoid. And they used to harvest the grain, barley at night and offer it by day. So that's the Omer offering. The halacha is that you may not harvest any of your new crops until before the barley is harvested for the Omer offering, meaning before the barley is harvested, typically on the 2nd night of Pesach. You also may not eat from the new crop you may not eat from the new crop until the Omer is offered on the 2nd day of Pesach. So essentially, your your cycle year for knowing what's called new and what's called old revolves around the 2nd day of Pesach. It revolves around the 2nd day of Pesach and the cutting of the offering of the Omer. When we say that you cannot eat the new crop, that means anything that, as we're going to see soon, anything that took root before the harvesting of the Omer to be offered on the 2nd day of Pesach, anything that took root before that is considered old crop. And therefore, once you harvest the barley for the Omer to be offered on the 2nd day of Pesach, you can now harvest any of those crops. Once you offer the Omer on the 2nd day of Pesach, you can now eat from whatever took root before the harvesting of the Omer for the Omer offering the 2nd day of Pesach. If anything takes place after that point, meaning after, as we're going to see, after the point of harvesting the Omer for the offering of the 2nd day of Pesach, that's called Chadash, that's called new crop. And new crop cannot become permissible until the next Pesach when you offer the new grain of the Omer. So anything that is, let's call it anything that's before the second, we'll just keep it, simple right now. We'll get a little bit more specific as we learn the Mishnah. Then anything before the Omer is considered old. It's the previous year's crop, which then becomes permitted with the offering of the Omer on the 2nd day of Pesach of the new barley. And anything from after that Omer is considered for the new year, and it's forbidden until the following Pesach, when again you offer on that Pesach the new barley grain. That's the system. That's how it works. So therefore, the Mishnah says like this: the prohibition of chadash, of eating the new grain before Pesach, which really means before the Omer is offered on the 2nd day of Pesach. Once the first day of Pesach doesn't help you, it's only after the Omer is offered on the 2nd day of Pesach. That prohibition of eating of the new grain only applies to these 5 grains we just mentioned. It doesn't apply to rice. It doesn't apply to millet. and you may not harvest any of these grains before the new barley is harvested for the Omer offering on the second day of Pesach. Again, that only applies to these 5 grains, not to other grains like rice and millet. Now, these prohibitions that we've been talking about, or these prohibitions that we're talking about of the new crop that you cannot eat or you cannot harvest, that is based on the if they took root before the Omer was brought. If they took root before the Omer was actually harvested, then that is already called that's the previous year's grain. That's the old grain. That's called the Lashon. That's called the old grain, the previous year's grain. And the Omer over the second day of Pesach will permit that grain. It'll permit that grain to be harvested once the barley for the Omer is harvested. You're going to be allowed to eat it once the Omer is offered. But that only is going to work on what took root before the Omer that's going to be offered on that Pesach was harvested. The Imlav, but if they didn't take root before that, it means they took root after the Omer was harvested for that year's offering on the second day of Pesach, then that's already the next year's crop. That's called Yashki Chodesh. That's the new stuff. And that cannot be harvested nor eaten until the following Pesach, when the new barley next Pesach is harvested and then offered. And if not, they're forbidden until the coming of the next year's Omer offering. So again, all this only applies to these 5 grains: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye, but it doesn't apply to other grains like millet and to rice. Okay, we continue now with the laws of Lashon Harah from the Chafetz Chaim. And we are now in Perek Ches, chapter 8, Sif Beis, paragraph 2. Now we're going to talk about whom it is forbidden to speak Lashon Hara about. Isa Lashon Hara hu bein al ish o isha. It applies to speaking about a man or a woman. Bein chilek bein ish to elisha acheres. There's no difference whether it's your wife or another woman. Many people stumble with this. Because they think it's permissible to speak badly of one's wife, or of his father-in-law's household, in front of his brothers or his father's family. And it doesn't make a difference that it's your wife. It's probably worse if it's your wife. Actually, I shouldn't say probably, it is worse if it's your wife. And there's no difference. It doesn't make a difference if your wife and who it is that you're saying it to. At the end of the day, if you're speaking Lashon Hara about someone, it's Lashon Hara. And as I've said, it's probably worse if you're speaking Lashon Hara about your wife to your family. Okay, so that is V'gam. Okay, and so that's the first paragraph. Next paragraph Gimel, Sif Gimel, paragraph Gimel. Sometimes it is impossible for a prohibition of Lashon Hara to be on a child. For instance, to speak badly of an orphan child, who's being raised by other people in their home. If you speak badly of them, you start talking about the kinds of things that they're doing that's wrong, that's going to be a problem. Because if he's a troublemaker, they may just send him out of the house. Any type of things that you say about a minor, about a child, that can cause the child to be hurt or to cause the child suffering, that's going to be, that's Lashon Hara. Now let's say the reason you're telling the story is because, unfortunately, this troubled child, is making a lot of problems. And the reason you're trying to tell other people about it is to put them on the right path. Then it's permissible. You have to make sure that what you're saying is the absolute truth. Not just to rely on what you hear from others. Others say, oh, this kid is making trouble. He's making some serious trouble. You can't go telling others about it unless you first go ahead and know it yourself. Just hear it from others. You can't just go ahead and quickly rely on that to tell others. You also have to be able to realize the ramifications of what can come from what you're saying. Because sometimes there's some serious problems, some serious wrongdoings that come out of this. Meaning, you've got this orphan child who's going through, who's been gone through a lot and is acting out. Now, it may be necessary to tell others about it for the purpose of trying to get that child on the right path. The problem is that sometimes the Chavetz Chaim says that it was often a problem that when it came to telling others about trying to put the kind of child on the wrong path, it was done incorrectly. It was done in a way that wasn't right. Which means you were saying it in order for the purpose of helping the child, but at the end, you told it to people who took things in their own hand and they did it very wrong. So you have to keep that in mind, that even though your intention is to say this about the child for the child's benefit, you got to realize who you're talking to, who you're saying it to, what you're saying, in order to realize what the ramifications beyond what your intentions are could be. And if the ramifications can be very negative from what you're saying, although your intention is to go ahead and help the child, then you can't say it. So these are the kinds of things the Chavetz Chaim is saying, very delicate situations that even though your intentions may be correct, you have to still realize the ramifications, the consequence of what can come out of it. Have a wonderful day.